Well, another part of my story that I guess I'm starting to share more openly about is that I was molested when I was 3 years old, and that's really my first memory. And so I was able to, thanks to a song by Amy Grant called Ask Me, it came out in 91, I was able to kind of really start to identify what had happened to me and told my parents and got help, in 5th and 6th grade. And then I've also dealt with it as an adult in therapy. But it seems like lately there have been these situations. Over this last summer, it was like Christine Blasey Ford giving her testimony about Kavanaugh. And I just recognized something in her testimony about how, like, speaking about that sexual trauma and how, I just identified with it as like, that is how I see myself when I'm talking about it. It's kind of hesitant. It's not overly emotional. And then watching Leaving Neverland, the Michael Jackson documentary with the two boys who were talking about what they say Michael had, how he abused them. And I just also identified with them so much. So there's also this thing though, Miles, where it's like, and having been through this situation a few times as a survivor, I'm identifying with those people and I'm feeling like I'm having what seems like such a holy like moment of just like, I hear you, understand you. And then I go online and I see people that I know calling these people liars, saying they're just doing, and just attacking them. And it's hard not to feel that personally because I've had that connection with them. So I know that like I've been dealing with this with my therapist, but I know that you probably are seeing this kind of like, what do you do when you feel like your situation is being attacked? It's
triggering something.
Yeah. Because it'll throw you off. I mean, it throws me off.
Yeah. What is if I may ask, the primary emotion that you feel when you read those comments?
When I read those comments, like with the Christine Blasey Ford thing, it was a lot of people from back home in Alabama, and it made me really start to feel unsafe for the child that lived there and went through that I wouldn't be believed. And also really frustrated and angry that these people aren't able to apply this situation to their loved ones and put themselves in that situation. It's hard for me to, I guess, see the other side as well.
Well, I'm glad you shared that because I think unsafe is a pretty common response for, and we're seeing it a lot right now, not just with abuse survivors, but just everybody who spends time consuming media, because that there is a vicarious and secondary component to trauma that by seeing it, experience it, and watching it all day, and then seeing the conflict that surrounds it, it can that can be traumatizing in itself. So, in other words, secondary vicarious trauma is when you spend time hearing about other people's painful circumstances and it actually can take it on and feel like yours. That's a common thing in the helping profession for people who are therapists and other people. But now the media is such a 24-hour cycle that we all experience it. In your case, and thanks for the courage to share that. I can relate to it, and there's so many people I know that can relate to it. But for anybody, those of us that have experienced a certain kind of abuse, especially sexual trauma in nature, then we're going to be a little more sensitive to when we see or experience that. Because in a sense, it can take us back to either the moment it happened or the response we got when we spoke up about it. And that second part's important. It sounds like you, and I don't want to assume that, but it sounds like your response, or the people you went to, your parents actually showed up in support. So that's a bonus. That doesn't always happen. And often the first person we choose to tell, their response can be as traumatic as the abuse itself if we're not embraced, heard. And so I think as abuse survivors, we're sensitive to it. So we feel we know the courage it takes to speak up. And when we see anybody add trauma on top of trauma, then it brings up an appropriate emotion, which would be fear, anger, sadness. Some of it's personal, some of it's just in a protect. That's why you see so many of our best advocates out there for a variety of different issues where people who've experienced pain and emotion themselves, they got to a point where they felt like suppressed voices needed to be lifted up and they used their pain for good. But you're speaking about something that I get asked about all the time now. Like, how do I handle this ongoing consumption of media when I'm feeling triggered all the time? Two indicators. One could be that the fact that your body is awake and experiencing certain emotions is a sign that your health, that you've done really good work. And another indicator could be if it were to get worse, like if it were it makes me feel really unsafe and sad to where it starts giving you other symptoms like it's actually affecting my sleep or it's causing anxiety and it's kind of getting big. Then it might be a sign of maybe deeper work around that particular thing. So it could be both, but it's ultimately a sign that you're awake and alive to it.
That's another thing that I wanted to kind of talk about, Miles, is so that I feel like part of this is I think it would help people to understand kind of what it looks like when somebody's talking about their trauma in a public space, the things to look for, because I think that I identify it because I've been there, but I think a lot of other people think like, you're too calm talking about this traumatic thing right now.
Like it must not have been that bad.
Like why aren't you really upset talking about this in front of the world? So what is your insight on that? Like what it looks like?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I think it's different for everybody. There's so much we know and so much we don't know about trauma and how it impacts the brain. The good news is that it is very much a part of today's narrative. And 15 years ago, that wasn't the case in mental health. And I used to be more in the addiction space than the space I'm in now. And then people weren't even talking about trauma when I first got into it. And now everybody is starting to recognize that there is typically a narrative that is underneath anything that we would use to compound or numb unhealthy behavior, whether it's addiction, other types of mental health. That a lot of times trauma is what's underneath it. So we're talking about it, but I would say that we are where, maybe a little further than that, but kind of where computer science was in the 80s. When you remember how fast and everything, that's when the tech just took off shortly after that. But I think we're there with trauma. It's an exciting time because we're learning a lot about the science of it, but there's still so much we don't know. But one thing we do know is that everybody seems to respond a little differently to it. There are some commonalities and themes, but you could take two soldiers, for example, that experience combat, and one could come back and develop post-traumatic stress syndrome symptoms, and the other one could be well adapted and go back into life. A lot of times, more often than not, it has to do with their early attachment. So if there was any early adversity, then you can predict that if you experience it later in life, that you're going to develop some of those symptoms faster. And I guess to make that a little more clear, when we do some vets work, and when we work with combat veterans, we often never touch the combat stress. We go back into childhood, and it's usually sexual abuse or something else that we're dealing with that we can't really work on this trauma until we go back to the original wound. But when you see people talk about it, do the best you can to stay in an empathetic position to the courage it takes for somebody to speak their truth. If they have a flat affect, if they're wildly emotional, if they're anything in between, just know that that's their journey. And we have no idea what part of the process they're in. If it's the first time they've talked about it or the 100th time they've talked about it, they deserve whatever emotion comes with it because they've busted their ass to come through it to this place, whether they've done any work or not. I've seen it just looks different. Now, if we took 3 cases of media stories where somebody was revealing their truth on TV, could we overanalyze all their responses? Absolutely. I just more or less want to say that it's different for everybody, and everybody deserves a space to be held and respected when they're speaking their truth.